Thank you. That's never happened before. Well, good evening, and thank you for that welcome, and welcome to everyone. I'm Richard Sommer, in case I haven't met some of you, and I'm a member of the faculty here and the dean. So before we get started, as has become our custom, I want to read our land acknowledgement, and acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Okay, for those of you who are maybe visiting the Daniels building for the first time, I'm excited in particular to welcome you to the faculty's main hall, which was designed in part to engage a broader community in Toronto and beyond in discussions and debates on how architecture, art, landscape architecture, and urban design can affect meaningful change today. So tonight's event is part of the Daniels Home and Away series, which, as the title suggests, brings together talent and ideas from near and far for a series of discussions focusing on a different theme or issue, and I'll be getting to tonight's theme in a moment. So, though we are still, we're just now, I think, past the halfway point in the winter semester with our students, we still have a number of incredible lectures scheduled to take place in the coming weeks, so I want to encourage all of you to visit our website and learn about what the upcoming talks and symposia might be. So far in this Home and Away series, we have had pairings that looked at urban housing, animate responsive monument making, artificial intelligence and city design, the landscapes of the Anthropocene, and the myths surrounding architectural postmodernism, just to name a few things. Tonight, we'll be examining the way that architecture intersects with, or perhaps even drives, what has come to be called the experience economy. And we'll be doing that with two designers who I believe are on the vanguard of this phenomenon. The concept of the experience economy has been around for a few decades, and it's a product really of a kind of teleological history or a periodization in which society is viewed as having evolved through first agrarian and then industrial economies, and to more recently what we understood as a service economy, and now to what some people are calling an experience economy. The idea is that now many advanced economies are focused on transforming experiences somehow into valuable memories. Architecture in the experience economy becomes the interface of, among other things, climate, food, music, theater, work, sport, and is in the role of conjuring atmospheres that are urban, rural, and everything in between. Well, now, we might just say that this sort of this is just really a reconceptualization of what we used to call tourism, but it really is more than that. It moves beyond a consumerism focused on the acquiring of things towards something more capable of engaging human emotion, social aspirations, and fantasy. And I would say a rather mundane manifestation of this that we're all familiar with is the taking of selfies, or people taking selfies at key moments and sites and posting them to social media. That's a kind of, a kind of simplification of the experience economy, but we've all seen it happen a lot. But in case this actually might seem as something that's trivial, I would argue that significant architecture and landscape architecture has perhaps always been about the production of memories and experiences. What is the Roman bath or sleep temple or the religious pilgrimage sites of the late medieval period or the holiday hotels of the 19th century or today's art parks like Storm King if they're not experience architectures? So we brought these two gifted designers who are intensely engaged with these issues together tonight to present their work and sort of start to think about this. And I'll begin with Matt Davis, who's representing home tonight. He's an alumnus of the Daniels faculty and a co-founder of the acclaimed multidisciplinary design firm DesignAgency, where he shares helm with partners Anwar, I'm not going to get this name right, Mekhayech, and fellow Daniels alumnus Alan Chan. Their Toronto-based studio, and also offices around the world, unites interior and architectural concepts and design with strategic branding and visual communication. Known for reimagining the architecture of hospitality, their firm is sought after by clients throughout North America, Europe, and beyond. DesignAgency's global success is based on a combination of design and business savvy, and its ability to create unique environments is built out from narratives they craft in partnership with their clients. So, representing our away speaker tonight, I'm very happy to welcome Barbara Bestor here to Toronto. Barbara is the founding principal of Bestor Architecture. Since 1995, Bestor Architecture has actively redefined what we understand as the architecture of Los Angeles, with a practice that rigorously engages the city's culture through design, art, and urbanism. Her firm is increasingly applying the lessons of Los Angeles now to other places. Barbara explores new dimensions in architecture through experiments in spatial arrangement, graphics, and color, all of which is evident in her projects for custom residences, international headquarters for companies, and international headquarters for companies, and also hotels. Her body of work is about connecting with people on many levels, often outside the boundaries of those that have been traditionally delineated for architecture. Barbara believes that good design creates an engaged urban life and embraces the quote, strange beauty, unquote, that enhances everyday experience. She received her undergraduate degree at Harvard University, studied at the Architectural Association in London, and received her master's degree in architecture at SciArc in Los Angeles. She writes frequently on architecture and design and is the author of Bohemian Modern, Living in Silver Lake. So a quick note before I bring our speakers to the stage about tonight's format. Our two speakers will present, and later we'll have a conversation and audience take questions from the audience. This is going to be moderated by my colleague, Stephen Fong. In case you don't know, Stephen has a long history teaching here at the Daniels faculty. He is most recently the founder of Office Make Good, or OMG, a practice that unabashedly engages market-driven narratives and at the same time aligns itself with the reflectivity of architectural culture. OMG utilizes a deep understanding of commonplace techniques to realize projects characterized by highly scrutinized assemblies. So one last thing then, around the kind of way in which we've assembled this talk tonight. Building on the experience economy theme, our speakers will be presenting their work tonight roughly under 4 themes. The first theme is the role of the experiential and sensorial phenomena in framing the program and form of architecture. The second, the rise of informality and informal arrangements in the way we are creating new spaces we occupy. Third, location, or the role of site, geography, and culture in creating an architecture of difference. And fourth, and this is the big one, which is probably the most fuzzy, but I think will be the most provocative, the power we have to engage and work with the world as it is, as opposed to always thinking it is our role, especially at the schools, to imagine another world. So please join me in welcoming Barbara Bestor and Matt Davis to the stage.
Test, test. Good. can hear me too. So I don't know about you, Matt, but I did not know how this format worked. So we each have slides up per category, and we're going to have to
just wing it.
We're just have to wing it.
I thought Stephen was.
I thought you were going to ask us questions,
okay.
Stephen. Yeah. Okay. Let's see the role of experience. Let's see what's first. We don't know.
It's the Broadview Hotel.
Okay.
Yeah. How many people have anybody been to the Broadview Hotel in Toronto? This is a project we worked on with ERA Architects here in the city. It's a project that came to be because the previous owners, this was a gentleman's club, and gentleman's club, using it very loosely. The previous owners decided from the booth that they loved, they couldn't see the stage, so they decided to have a wall removed. When they removed the wall, the whole building caved in and was instantly for sale, and that's when our clients picked it up. And we got an opportunity to participate in restoring this project. Since we're talking about this in terms of experience and how we're generating or thinking about programming spaces like this, there's obvious inputs that go into thinking about this type of space. It's historic. It's got all the historic elements to it, the layers of what's gone on in the past. It's also a community, so how you take this project, which is very much like the Drake Hotel on the west side, in an area that's not really, hasn't fully rejuvenated yet or hasn't really fully seen its heyday. How do you take this project and activate the community? How do you engage them? How do you engage all the historic notes? Where am I putting this? Oh, I skipped ahead a couple. And then obviously there's the notorious history of the building itself, so the legacy of who's used this in the past. And then there's the architectural elements. The beautiful architecture of the historic building, but then there's the layers of the interior spaces, which were really kind of seedy over time. It was kind of a rooming house. It had gone through it had been a hotel before. It was a gentleman's club. It goes all the way back to being a kind of a sports club at one point in time. There's great architectural elements and bones to the space. So there's elements like the fire escape and so forth. But in the rejuvenation of this project, because it had collapsed, all the historic elements on the inside of the space had to be stripped away. It was reskinned from the inside out. So all the new structural columns put in, and everything was kind of shored up. But the entire inside of the building had zero character. So you have all this beautiful character on the outside, and nothing was left on the inside. Again. So when we were looking at how to work through this problem set of thinking about community engagement, levels of experience within the guest journey and the guest experience, bringing the community in not only as a participant within the different activity spaces, but also the community as an active participant in renting out areas, renting out rooms, and so forth. So we typically would look at a project like this in several ways. We'd start off with like the operational flow. This is one of probably about 50 map of kind of different plans we did in the early days. In the operational flow kind of scheme, we're looking at program blocking, what has to go where, what's going to create operational functionality. But then we always layer that up against things like these heat map exercises where we're really looking at how we're intensifying the guest journey and the customer's experience of the space. And that ultimately results in a kind of a floor plan and a space plan that we massage and pull back and forth as we move along. With the design, the final design then pulls in a lot of elements and different kind of ideas of how we experience the spaces. The main lobby itself has a little bit of the reference, and you'll see this come in through some of the brass poles, referencing a little bit of that naughty history. There's an element, I think this is the laser pointer. Yeah. So if you look at this building here, this is the original building. There's the fire escape that wrapped up the side. It was probably one of the last fire escapes in the city. They're very far between. They're hard to find. Obviously, no one uses them anymore. So instead of having that scrapped, we had commissioned an artist to take the fire escape and repurpose that and bring that back into itself, repurposing the history and bringing it back into the fold. Other elements that we custom designed then a little bit referential to a time place, so we custom designed the furniture to really fit with the style or the narrative that we were trying to tell. The cafe, so the ground floor, if you didn't notice on the space plan, ground floor has a restaurant, a cafe, and the lobby space itself. I'll show you kind of some other trends that are happening in the hospitality sector, the hotel sector later. But within the cafe was kind of imagined to be this workplace where people from the community could come in. It has to transition from daytime to nighttime. So you can have, you can wake up in the morning and have your breakfast there, and then it goes into a full bar later in the evening. Again, we have a little reference point to some of the notorious past. Was the most fun element to play off of. So this is this neon kind of sculptural piece, and we were lucky enough. We hired an artist out of Chicago to come in. He's a neon guru when it comes to crafting and sculpting these pieces. But the fabricator was a good find. The fabricator was actually the grandson of the original neon artist who did the Jilly's sign on the front of the building. So there's a nice, again, a little nod to some of the references there. I'm trying to see over my shoulder for what the other slide is. So within the same space, again, trying to create different experiences, different moods of experience as you move through the day or move through your kind of week. So if the cafe itself was a bright, airy space that has, co-working abilities and kind of that kind of functionality, the Civic we wanted to make a little bit more of a tavern. Again, a bit of a historic nod to what would have been there when the original building was done. So we pulled in a kind of a twist to that. Everything, again, has to be kind of recreated or brought into the space. We don't want to do it in too much of a themed way, but we're trying to create a sense of authenticity through some of the pieces. Then as you kind of move through the space, you go up to the rooftop, and the rooftop has a whole new set of experiences. So you have the restaurant experience, the cafe experience. Now the rooftop experience is an indoor-outdoor kind of a bar, tavern, or bar kind of lounge experience. Part of what we wanted to create here, again, was this very rare connection in Toronto between the inside and outside, being able to open up walls and have bars and kind of socializing experiences that kind of transition through the walls, and really extend the seasons. Over my shoulder this way, you can see, again, this is with the walls closed and a little bit of the lounge itself. It's a nice detail shot, playing off the mid-century. And then this is again, as we're trying to build these different kind of spaces of wonder, if you will, this space was the old bell tower. And again, historically, we had to preserve everything, which was great. But instead of just turning it into a mechanical room or something like that, we wanted to, again, bring it back into the fold as something that customers or guests would experience. So going from that kind of mid-century space on the rooftop, so you're starting historic and you're kind of moving up to mid-century, we wanted to give it, again, a throwback to a kind of an otherworldly space that, again, has this little bit of a Hogwarts feel going on here. But, playing off of, again, a hospitality need of sorts. And then the rooms themselves, again, because it's a hotel, it has to have rooms. We wanted to, again, play up a little bit of the boudoir feel. So there's elements that have been brought through, everything from the wallpapers all the way through to some of every custom design piece of furniture to try to craft that experience. One of the really interesting things when we were looking at this project, you had, obviously it was a derelict building we were walking through. There was all kinds of little treasures to be found here and there. But one of the most interesting treasures we found was we walked into one of the rooms and there was this kind of half hanging off piece of wallpaper, and we pulled the wallpaper down, and under the wallpaper there was a dozen layers of wallpaper. It kind of went all the way back, and you start realizing that you were kind of doing this kind of archaeological find or archaeological dig as you're peeling apart the different layers. So we had 10 years ago, it was the 2008, we were peeling that away, and you kind of went through all the kind of the 70s, the 60s, the 50s. But what was really funny was the last layer of wallpaper that was on the wall almost identically matched the very first layer of hand-painted wallpaper that had been put on 100 years ago, 100 plus years ago. So we used some of those references in creating new wallpapers. Some of those layers created this wallpaper. Some of those layers created the wallpaper that were in the cafe. And the idea is that now it has its ground zero, and it's going to start building up and becoming part of the fold in that way. Oh, now you're under
this
you.
is me. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I just do one project per section. I don't know.
I have no idea. I thought that things would run in the background while we chatted. So this is a cafe. I guess I'll go back to the sort of idea of the experience, economy, and I love your project and that idea that sometimes I call it sort of the domestication of the urban environment, that you're trying to, like, rather than just making more generic junk space everywhere, that when you are going to make anything, whatever scale, you make it very specific so that there is a kind of an experiential takeaway from it. And so for us, like, the work might be something at this scale, which is like a cafe that's, I guess it's like 10 years old now, but kind of helped cause the boom in cement pattern tile, I think. But largely because I had gone on a trip to Istanbul right before this and had been in these immersive rooms, and I had suddenly had this job. I was like, oh, maybe I'll do something with tile, and found some people that make it in Nicaragua. So this was sort of this kind of thing was like a rethinking. This is the beginning of third wave coffee shops, and the role of the barista had suddenly become this important role and job type, which didn't exist when I was younger. I think it would have been maybe the bike messenger when I was younger or something. But so the sort of performative role of making coffee. So our big thing was sort of taking the counters down to kind of table height, which is now fairly typical. It wasn't so much at that time. People were sort of hidden behind a thing, and making that more of a performance and a kind of transactional, sort of theatrical space. Let's see if I can make this go. There we go. So on the other hand, like a lot of stuff that we end up doing is workspaces that are very, very big. And people who work in them often have to work a lot of hours and days in a row. And when you have a large scale space, I think the old norm for office work kind of hewed to high modernism, where it was sort of like a generic kind of idea across the board. And one of the things we've done is taken our previous experience in kind of more retail and restaurant spaces and brought that into like large scale workspace, trying to create very different kinds of spaces within this large floor plate. So like almost little city inside of plates, and things that are really trying to be fairly heterogeneous, like not like each other necessarily. So like this is part of about 350,000 square feet we did for Snapchat across like 6 buildings in Santa Monica, kind of weird buildings. This was an interesting building actually, but trying to bring character and like sort of a sense of place into this space, so that the kind of the places that aren't the regular workspaces have a real character. So in this case, we would design a wallpaper like that. We kind of had this idea of bringing nature into this particular building because it didn't have a lot of windows, and we were using materials that were like green, or we made this leaf pattern. We have like natural wood floors and a lot of fiber materials. So these are a bunch of workspaces in that same complex of across 6 buildings, like offices. So each, a given floor plate might have, I don't know, 100 people working on it, and that you kind of have spaces to go within that building that are just different from each other, different personality types. The introvert might prefer a quieter, solitary space, the social person's at the busy cafe. So this is kind of shows that there's a lot of room actually for a kind of architectural and artistic kind of invention and experiment in this kind of a workspace. These are more of those. This is actually within that same complex. We got to take over an old diner and kind of repurpose that into this big commissary. We brought a lot of plants in. And this is a whole bunch of different, these are actual restaurants, not in a workspace, but kind of showing these different approaches. Like one of them, say the upper right and the upper left is a juice place in a historic part of Pasadena, where we took sort of the historical fabric and wrapped it inside, but then we did a very sort of pop art graphic wall once you're inside the thing that's on the left. I guess this idea of like immersivity is something that we were talking about beforehand with Richard and Stephen, that you also, I think, have to work harder these days as an architect or an interiors person to kind of get people's attention away from their phone, to be honest. Like you actually have to be aggressively strong, I think, as a place in order to kind of be worth looking up at, because there's an awful lot of things to look at on your screens. And this is a project, this is an exhibit design for a show about Lina Bo Bardi, the architect, and Albert Frey, also an architect, is at the Palm Springs Museum. And we decided to do like a very immersive kind of color space, because the objects were generally like drawings and some models that architecture students had done, but the architects themselves had this sort of really strong vocabulary, a lot of joie de vivre, a lot of sort of language. Like, for instance, this kind of shows the vocabulary that we attributed to Albert Frey, who's sort of the yellows and the blues, and Lina Bo Bardi with these kind of her famous kind of punched out openings in concrete. We took those as two-dimensional graphics that we then turn into these sort of three-dimensional spatial organizing things by cutting away these walls and these scrims that were in the space. So the architect's kind of vocabulary starts to imbue the space that their work is shown in. So on the bottom here, you have a Lina Bo Bardi shape. Even the table is kind of shaped according to one of her cutouts. We'd sort of made a template out of one of her buildings. And the Albert Frey is kind of, I think the next picture probably is.
It's stubborn.
Oh, not there. Oh. Well, I think we're ready. These are more exhibit designs that are an installation that we did that was like a disco at SciArc called the Silent Disco. The upper left pictures where we wanted to do something that was relief space for students who are attached to their computer. So you could come in and plug your iPhone or whatever into this thing, was all wired for sound and had a light show, so you could just sort of turn it on anytime. If you had time off, you could have this disco in the school, along with sort of backstage kind of pink zones that were more libidinal.
Do you want us to stop there?
Yeah.
Okay. It's interesting how the workspaces and people are now, like, no one stops working, and then when they're at work, they have to have different environments to work in.
It's like architecture school.
Yeah, it's like
Except
this is a great training ground for that.
So one of the things that seems to come out of both of the work is this notion of broadening the audience for design-based work. And certainly there are levels of at which you appreciate these works that go beyond what you would normally think was architecture like 20 years ago, perhaps. I think that's the theme that you're picking up on with showing the color, the texture, the thinking about the projects. And Matt, it was interesting. Your work seemed to be, you almost described the Broadview Hotel as archaeological in nature.
That's right. Yeah.
That in some way you want us to understand and participate in that side of it, and that in some way the layers of the building are made to be visible for people.
Yeah, I think it's, it was a conscious effort to try to understand, obviously, some of the elements that were there. You're not trying to, what we were trying not to do was be just recreate or mimic an experience, or mimic a kind of an aesthetic, or mimic a kind of a finish. What we really wanted to do was try to create or capture the energy and the historic energy that might have been in these different spaces and kind of layer that up. It's also a kind of a stacking of different, not only program elements, but it's a stacking of different ideas and different, not necessarily themes, but different moods as you move from place to place. And that's kind of where we're trying to capture indirectly some of the history of the building itself.
So we should segue into our second theme, the rise of informality. So we were thinking that this was a discussion about a variety of things, how, let's say, in the projects that we're looking at, a range of restaurants, hotels, workplaces, you can say that there's been maybe what you'd call a turbulence due to generational change, due to changes in media, and that this turbulence is about a new informality, and that the work in some way deals with this. So let's look at this set of images then.
I think you're up first on this one.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, let's see. Oh, yes. Okay, so I guess, I like the idea of sort of keeping this conversational, but these are a variety of residential, bits of residential interiors generally in houses that we did the house itself, but I guess I sort of included a cluster of them to show a kind of vocabulary that, let's say, isn't one of minimalism. Not minimalism. Let's just call it that. This is a house in Malibu, in Point Dume for a former rock star, but the house that we did is actually this cut in the middle. It was this funny house. It was like a summer camp, like a dilapidated summer camp, and we just cut out a big chunk in the middle and built a new living room, kitchen, and kind of remodeled around it. But I think what I liked about it, it did seem to speak to the informality, like a kind of a, let's say, relatively high-end house, but the whole issue of the house in a way is informality and kind of connectivity. Oh, there's our owner over there. But this kind of indoor outdoor.
What he's a former rock star?
Mike D, Beastie Boys.
That's awesome. He's still a rock star, I would say.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. Yeah. But so sort of taking literally the outside of the siding of the old part of the house as new stuff that kind of goes inside and outside, along with like a poured concrete piece that goes inside and outside, really trying to break down like the living room into more of like a surf shack on a large scale, which is a weird job. This is the garage turned into a screening room. Oh, and this is something else. So, but I guess so I'm an advocate of a kind of growing informality. I feel like most of our lives are much less formal, our dress, our work lifestyle, and that it's an interesting thing when you talk about it in terms of like formalism in the academic and discursive sense, because I think there's also, I'm sure you guys experience it in school, like there's a less of a single clear ideological path for formalism right now. And so kind of really researching what might be an informal path of formalism is something I'm interested in. So that's the main drag in Beats by Dre, the headquarters for Beats by Dre, which is now Apple Music. And my slide's not moving. Oh, here we go. This is within that is, surprise, a coffee shop. But this is sort of a built into a larger texture, which, see if I can get this to work. The space was a big warehouse where we cut out 2 big courtyards, this is one of them, and a main drag, which was that big sort of museum type of stair. And they really sort of are there to bring light into the middle of what was a pretty pancake flat 2-story warehouse, and then also to create different kinds of spaces. So this blue courtyard is something for the group that surrounds it, which is the operations team. Ops are people who are moving shipping containers at 3 in the morning, you know, in Hong Kong somewhere, kind of, they have a very quiet, focused, computer-oriented life, and they requested a space that was somewhat meditative, and for me that sort of was like a library kind of space, like I thought of the beautiful Swedish library. Anyhow, so this is sort of what we ended up doing to this building, cutting the 2 big openings, creating this sort of circulation connector, and using light in the courtyards to bring light throughout the workspace. But we also had to deal with the sort of funny existing building, which had millions of columns. You couldn't take the columns out because of the terrible soil conditions. So we had all these columns that we would sort of sometimes use as a kind of sculptural element, and sometimes we'd kind of enclose them and end up with these pockets like this. So it's kind of like making a silk purse out of a sow's ear kind of thing, like creating like a special place. This is like the most Instagrammed place in Beats. This was the other courtyard, the parallel courtyard, which was for the marketing department, who are the creatives and kind of wanted more of an art studio space. Everything's whiteboards. It's very flexible, much more, let's say, stripped down than the other courtyard. And this is a staircase that's a secondary staircase to the main big wood one. This is the kind of quick dash down to get coffee when you don't really want to look at everybody or be seen, as opposed to the other one, which is sort of more of a grand operatic stair. And having that kind of flexible possibilities in a workspace with, this has about 500 people in it, it's kind of important that you have these different paths, almost like a small city. You know, you can take the alley, you can take the main street. I'm not having a lot of luck with this clicker. Oh, these are some of the kinds of things. So we, to help do wayfinding and kind of define different quadrants of the building, we had a color coding system, and we did a lot of vinyl wallpaper graphics that were in meeting rooms or in different areas to kind of help, to kind of know if you're in the blue or the red zone, and the gold and the silver zone, when sort of cheeky, that it's the executive area. So we made it sort of blingy with the has a private stair for, you know, celebrities visiting Beats. This is one of the executive offices. And in this thing, we do the interiors or something like this, but we also do those graphics. And it was a lot of times in something like this, the people who are running the company want to make sure that their office sort of exemplifies them, but also like their vision for their business. This is my thing. Oops. We'd hired Yuan Ban to shoot all these portraits of LA from different points of view, like in general, like places like where Dr. Dre had grown up was like one of our shots, or Long Beach Harbor with the shipping container. So we sort of throughout the office space are all these portraits of the city that help kind of differentiate it than, say, like a typical tech company in Silicon Valley that was really rooted in LA, but again, through these different ways of seeing it.
Thanks. It's interesting, I think, though, there's been a big shift in the workplace environment. We're working right now on Neuhaus in LA and around the world, and it's amazing that and this is a great example of how formalism's broken down. The traditional office, the cubicles, all that stuff is kind of fading away, and even your office environments, the way that you've just done, it has to be experiential. Like, no, it's done not only to increase the attrition rate, but it's experiential for the people who are there. You're trying to attract new people in. They become in themselves a way very similar to hospitality, something that's, you don't want to say the brand word, but it's their branding. It becomes an extension of the brand. It becomes an extension of the ethos, which is, I think it's really interesting how that's shifted. The projects I'm going to show you here, this is a series of different hotel hostels we created throughout the world. These ones are mostly in Europe. About 8 years ago, we started working with a group to rethink this whole idea of what a hostel is. And to do that, we kind of broke it down into its core elements. You know, what do you need for a good hostel experience? Well, it's social spaces. You need to have amazing social spaces. The sleeping environment has to be good, but you want to kind of get people out of the rooms. You want to get people down and engaging and socializing, and rethink that whole idea of what a hostel used to be. Like, a hostel traditionally was a series of bunk beds. You would have, you know, a small place where you would have a continental breakfast, and it's like, get out the door and get out into the city, and then you would come back. This was much more about, you know, how do you create something not themed? How do you create something authentic? How do you capture these different travelers who are some very inexperienced? Sometimes they're traveling in groups, sometimes they're traveling as individuals, sometimes in pairs or whatever, or sometimes individual and then become pairs. But all those kind of situations we had to kind of map out. So this, I'll walk you through a couple of examples of what we've worked on here. This is a project we did in Amsterdam, just off of Oyster Park. This is an old zoology building that was converted into this hostel apartment complex. Again, being in Holland, there's tons of amazing referential things to pull in, tons of design inspiration, tons of kind of great design to work with. But what we try to do is try to engage the local designers to do their designs within our design. So things like these murals are done by a local artist who he's actually shows up in our Paris project as well, because he's both Parisian and Dutch, but by this artist who brought in a lot of the characteristics in the street life of the neighborhood. The lights were manufactured using old pieces that were found in the building, were remanufactured and turned back into light fixtures that were used within the project itself. Anywhere we could, we were obviously reusing existing materials and floor finishes. This is an example of what our hostel rooms look like. There's two types. I don't know if I had the one up here. Again, trying to create a really nice powerful movement. Again, sort of like the super graphics here, we commissioned a local wallpaper manufacturer to come up with a line specifically for the hotel. The beds themselves are very comfortable. One of the big inversions here for the generator concept was to rethink this whole sleeping idea and pull, I mean, it seems logical, but put washrooms in the bedrooms, as opposed to the hostel concept where you would walk down the hall, you'd wait in line for a shower or what have you. This whole rethinking of the necessities of what it meant to be a traveler meant pulling, if it's a room of 8, you would put a washroom within that room of 8, so that became its own little commune of sorts. If it's a room of 2, those beds can push back together, so it can actually be, you know, if you're individual when you start, you can be together when you end. So yeah, really trying to think that through, and then getting people down into the common spaces. This is a lab. This used to be the old lecture hall that we've converted into a multi-tiered experiential space. It has to be a bar, of course. It's a great generator of money, but the bar element is set up in a way that you can sit here individually or as a group, kind of work away on different things. People will bring you a beer, people will bring you lunch. Above you up here, as this kind of thing that we designed staggers up, you've got billiards tables and different activities as you kind of move up through the auditorium, and then that brings you into the kind of library spaces. This, again, we did them in about 13 different cities. This is Rome. This was an old Courtyard Marriott that we converted into this hotel. Again, trying to pull in some of the local references there. The architecture of the building was kind of a disgrace. There was nothing really that we could pull off of. Again, whenever we're doing these projects in these different cities, to try to get as authentic as possible, to try to immerse yourself in the culture, we kind of get our boots on the ground. We have a studio that's operating in Barcelona right now, and we try to get immersed in the culture, understand who the artists are who are doing the influential stuff, or maybe not even influential, just kind of the grassroots stuff. Find out who the local artisans are, go to the local markets, pick up the local pieces. So in this case, again, a local artist that we commissioned to do a piece. We had a lot of fun moving between the different markets and sourcing and finding old castaway pieces and repurposing those and bringing those back in, using the local artists again to kind of reanimate those pieces, give them life, give them a little character. So it's layering on to a kind of a castaway item. And again, very much like the Broadview Hotel, creating a different experiences in different zones. So you had the kind of cafe experience here, again a local tile, trying to create that full sense of the sensibility of authenticity. And then as you move through to the bar restaurant, we were just outside the local Chinatown, so we wanted to bring some of that influence back in to create, again, a fully almost schizophrenic nature between the different spaces. So when you're walking through or enjoying it, you can have those different moods throughout the different times of the day. This project was pretty influential. When we started doing these projects, there was no such thing as a category in all the award shows for budget luxury or budget focused. Definitely wasn't anything. No one was giving out awards for hostels. They were all fancy hotels and so forth. So this project actually created a category in the hotel circuit of awards. There's now a budget focused hotel category, and largely in part because of our Barcelona project. Barcelona was one of our first projects. We really, just like you, we had studied the city. We fell in love with the concrete paving patterns. Maybe we were influenced by some of your projects. But we also really fell in love with the different regions of the city. The city itself of Barcelona has all these different, very distinct regions. And this one's in Gracia. There's a very famous festival that happens once a year called the Fiesta de la Gracia, where all the locals come out and they do this kind of art explosion of recycled goods all through the different streets. And it becomes this kind of once a year festival. So we missed the festival, but we heard the legend of it, and we were inspired by the legend of the festival. So we went to one of the local artists who had done a piece on the street, and we commissioned her to come in and recreate this whole idea of this Fiesta de la Gracia in these lanterns that kind of move through the space. Barcelona's also famous for its street art, so we brought in a lot of those elements. And it's also Oh, that's not up yet. But when we opened the hotel, all the locals would come by and they were like, oh, it's the Fiesta del Garcia. You could see it all the way coming in from the street. So it kind of resonated with the locals as well. This almost looks like part of that project that you had up there with the wood slats. We were also influenced again by some of the more modern elements of Spanish architecture or Spanish design. So on the one side, we had a very colorful, very patinaed, very local, almost authentic space it felt like it was part of the neighborhood. On the other side, we wanted to infuse, in more of the hotel side, we wanted to infuse this sense of the architecture, a little bit of the shipbuilding history of the area, and kind of encapsulate that in this kind of transitional space that goes between the lobby and then goes upstairs to an area that we call the chill-out zone. This area is now clad with artwork. It becomes a bit of a gallery space. But it became, again, a bit of that schizophrenia, that move between one's very colorful, one's very calm and serene. It kind of adapts to different people in different times and different moods. Again, here you can see this is the hotel sector, but that's a typical hotel room. That room goes for about 60 euros a night. An average stay in a bed is about 8 euros a night. So you can tell like the spread of people who are occupying these suites goes from very young to very old. What was interesting is we did a project in Hamburg, which I'm not going to show, but the Hamburg project, a majority of our clientele, when we finished it all, very vibrant, very kind of youthful in its design, majority of the clientele were either flashbackers, people who wanted to relive old memories, or business travelers who were coming, and they were coming with they were traveling on the cheap, they were trying to get business done. So we found that these spaces that we were creating that we thought would be great socializing and networking spaces started becoming this whole idea of co-working and people working in our lobbies, which is now a very prevalent theme in hospitality. London, again, influenced my partner, Alan, who was a graduate from here as well, was really fascinated with the camouflage that used to go on the naval ships, the British naval ships, so he started playing with the explosions of these patterns. All throughout. So this is the early rendering. This is the actual finished product. This we found at a market in Shoreditch. And again, we had to have it. You have to have a smiley face in the lobby. Then again, finding there's like an artist who was doing a very similar program that was happening here in Toronto, where they would populate the street with these pianos, and people would come and play the pianos and activate the neighborhood. This artist had a piece that he wanted to display in here, again, very much like a community center. So you have all these strangers kind of mingling around the space, all these travelers, and somebody would sit up and start playing the piano, and all these travelers and strangers would start coming together and form a bit of a community unto itself. Again, a little bit more of London. Paris, I'm going to go a little faster because this could take all day. The Paris, there was some amazing references we could pull off of here. Again, we used a similar artist to create some of these patterns, some of the Moroccan influences. This is a fun little element. It's a discotheque in the basement, obviously a little nod to the Parisian metro, but we actually were able to find the original manufacturer who created the upholstery for the original tube trains, and we bought all the remaining stock of this fabric and clad the banquettes, and we're able to bring some of that reference back in. It's tacky as hell, but we wanted it for the narrative. It looks really interesting in the space. I think this is the last one. So Venice, this is a really interesting one. This kind of is when the whole budget hotel category started intersecting with more of the luxury hotel sector. So this project is in Venice. We had to work with the historic board. Here's an image of us trying to get a stain and a paint sample exactly right to match this little chip, because every part of the interior was governed by a historic designation. So it's not only the exterior, but also the interior. Every single move we had to do that touched the architecture had to kind of reference back to what was there in the past. To further that kind of sense of place and again, keeping with the local character, we had tons of fun going to the different markets. There's an amazing market in Parma, huge furniture fairs, finding all the different antiquities, bringing those pieces in. It's the most fun I've ever had shopping. In the end, this space became a really interesting exploration, not only of design, but also of programming. So we have like a space here, which is your check-in, coffee shop, bar, food program. Everything's kind of wrapped into one, so you can have 1 or 2 people servicing the entire hotel at once. It became an operational dream. A lot of these elements here in the staging pieces, I think that's the fireplace from before, kind of really reference our local wallpaper finds, really trying to keep it as tight to the original narrative as possible. This hotel, and why it kind of crossed over with Luxury World, this hotel, when we finished it, this hostel, when we finished it, we submitted it to all the different award shows, as you do when you're doing these kind of projects, and we won for best. We won a prize for best hotel lobby in Europe the year this came out. But the project we beat was a brand called The Edition, who I think Jabu Pushberg did it in London, which is a phenomenal project. So we were floored. We didn't think we would win with a hostel, but there's this kind of cross now where all the different things are blending together. Not only in hospitality and workplaces are blending together, but lifestyle and luxury and all these things are kind of blending together as people are wanting the best of the best at whatever price bracket they're in.
That was a great set of images. What we wanted to do to bind that set together was this whole idea of the rise of informality. So we saw in Barbara, your places to live, your places to work, in the way that we travel, this redefining of what things would look like. And it's in the restaurant world where fine dining has given way to fast casual and a number of things. And in many ways, these projects are a response to those ideas about the informality now, the social transformation.
And I guess one question is it, is it more democratic? Is there something that maybe there's more design at different levels than there used to be? It's less of a total luxury item only, the sort of high design. But at the same time, it tends to redefine like what is high design. If previously it was really defined in terms of the value and the cost of materials, plus the seriousness, say, and level of formalism of the architecture, I think that is probably less the common parlance of what is like high design now. It could be arte povera high design or something as well.
That's discussion about, we went to the market, we found this, we found that. Is a statement that the bespoke detail is no longer necessarily what makes something an architectural work or a design work.
Yeah, I think there's a place for both bespoke design pieces. I think what's interesting about in the variety of different designs is you have the ability now. I mean, the style is kind of broken down. There's not one particular dominant style. People with affluence and money are enjoying the things that are, again, very street level. Like there's a whole blend of what people are wanting. So in a lot of those market finds and stuff like that, in many ways what we're doing is almost like curating a gallery. You're trying to curate an exhibition of curiosities and trying to capture people's imagination by putting something that has a historic reference in a kind of a contemporary space. And it's that pull between where did this come from, why is it here, and it starts those little micro engagements. All the time they're on their phone doing whatever they're doing.
Well, Matt, especially in your work, and maybe this is something we pick up in the end, but there was that moment when you almost had, on one hand, what was being called the Williamsburg effect, and on the other hand, the architectural world, which was still trying to do sleek detailing.
Yeah, well, I think we'd like to try to do sleek detailing once in a while too, but yeah, it did. I think the interiors and the kind of hospitality space in particular got really kind of eclectic and messy for a while. I think you're going to see a resurgence right now of more of a pure design lines, and it's coming out of LA. LA is really motivating a lot of the design that's kind of spreading across North America, and the sensibility that's hitting a lot of these hospitality spaces. But I think as you again, I think a lot of it has to do with just who the user is and who's experiencing these spaces and what they want. I mean, that was a beautiful house, and you would never assume that a Beastie Boy lived there, and it's his wants are very similar to what other people's wants are, and it's again very democratic in its sensibility. It doesn't look austere. It's not. It's obviously very well crafted, but it doesn't have that kind of, you know, foreboding stand away approach. It's very accessible, and that's, you know, I think that whole blend of who has the money and the will and the want, it's all kind of shifting together.
Well, maybe that segues into our next segment. It's interesting that you said, well, this is an effect of Los Angeles, because this is a segment where we wanted to explore two theme aspects to this theme, essentially, which is, Barbara, is your practice, Matt, your practice, has it been affected by the place where you live and work, or the place where you started as a practice? And then also, is our particular works exemplars of a place? So that we'll start.
Do you want to start kick this series off? I think I start this one. I snuck a peek at the slides.
Oh, you did? Okay, well, you're then you better start.
Okay.
Better thumb, too.
I'll move rather quickly through this one. When we're talking about location, all of our projects, when we start our projects, we take a deep dive looking at, you know, where they are. We have quite a few projects in the city, so you can only do so many deep dives about what Toronto's about. But you have to really start digging deeper as you're trying to differentiate these different assets. I think we've got maybe 10 hotels or 12 hotels on the go right now in Toronto alone. Each one of them is trying to carve its own little niche out in its own little space. So as we're doing that, we're really trying to understand the minutiae of these different elements. This is a project that we did. It's the St. Regis. It was the deflagging of the Trump Hotel, which we're very proud of. And this was...
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah. And the Mayor John Tory cut the ribbon. This whole project was done with Marriott Starwood. Marriott Starwood's a massive conglomerate of two mega hotel brands. When they got together, they fused maybe 24 brands together. And so they have the St. Regis and the Ritz-Carlton, the Waldorf Astoria, and all these different brands that were competitors at one time under the same ownership umbrella in the same segment, sometimes in the same city. We did this, and we're also doing the Ritz-Carlton here in town. And they're essentially going after the same customer. So it's how do you differentiate that whole experience? And this is the refurbished lobby of what was the Trump. In particular, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the ceiling. Every element of this hotel had gone through a mill of what we're doing a lot for hospitality these days, which is doing this kind of brand narrative and this narrative journey exercise. I've foreshortened it here because it's boring as hell, but to go into too much detail. But when we're working with these mega brands, they like to isolate out things that they can identify with. So in this particular case, we looked at the historic insights of Toronto, so the place of meeting, and then we try to give that a kind of a patina, a style, a kind of a message. Physical insights, looking at the terrain. So Toronto itself has got obviously the very built-up terrain, but it historically also has a very natural terrain. And then the social insights. This is the idea that Toronto is a very green city. It's the park. It's inside, outside, and playing off of that. We don't bother reading it, but we tend to get a little bit deeper into like what these things are. And we're trying to give these primarily for the clients. We're trying to give these concepts, visuals that they can grasp onto, that we can then sell or build a narrative on, that we can then turn into design elements. Again, the physical insights, kind of giving them a reference of how we might draw the thread between one thing to another. Two different physical insights. The terrain is supple, the other one's very rigid. And the key part I'll draw out in this project is the ceiling here. So the ceiling itself, this ceiling space here, the St. Regis is historically, they love their ceilings. That's one of their feature elements. And so what we wanted to do here was we looked at, kind of inverting the natural strata of how the city has been developed. So you have the hard surface on the ground, so it's almost like the final layer of the building, the city itself, and then kind of work upwards to a little bit more of an organic history of the space. So this is, we worked with Moss and Lamb to create this idea. Moss and Lamb's a local artist, to create this kind of fluid ceiling that was based on some of the topography in and around the site historically. It's very subtle. The topography wasn't severe, so it emulates it pretty accurately. We went through a series of sketches, exercises, renderings, again, communicating with the client and trying to convey the ideas, down to the whole working with the artist, trying to fabricate and replicate this experience. And then this is the final product. So some of the elements here, again, every single piece was, again, to your point earlier, Stephen, is bespoke. It's all designed, it's all drawn, it's all detailed, and it's all custom fabricated. Most of it's fabricated locally, some of it's fabricated in Quebec, and great fabricators in Quebec. We got intrinsically involved with artists. This is an artist friend of mine, actually, kind of a surrogate father of mine, Edward Falkenberg, who, again, gave us the perfect inversion of our inverted concept, where we had the hard lines to the soft. He then brought in this kind of very organic form and the hard lines, so it kind of juxtaposed our overall concept. Where we go here. And then, again, that was the lower lobby space. The lobby space itself is a coffee bar, a bar. They do the sabering in there. It's a check-in experience. But then those concepts, again, got reinterpreted and remilled through and became the Louis Louis bar, the cocktail bar on the 35th floor. The bar here, again, it's just about the ceiling details. It's really about, again, creating every little aspect. So every single piece here was designed bespokely based on this narrative idea. So again, and the narrative is based on pulling from what is in Toronto and the history of Toronto.
Oh, that looks like mine.
Yeah, that's yours there. And sorry, all my projects are hospitality projects, so I'm stuck on my own theme.
Well, so this is, I guess in terms of location, this is in the hills of Echo Park, which is next to Silver Lake, and I used to live there, and I wrote this book sort of from a house that I did nearby this. But this project is 18 houses, and what it's doing is kind of not that. There's a thing in Los Angeles called small lots, which allows you to take regular lots and divide them into tiny little slices, but make them by right houses, so you can get like a typical mortgage on it, and it's a way of increasing density. That's a sort of a new tool in the city, but it generally results in a kind of two kind of railroad car sets with a driveway and parking below and these sort of regular towers. So we were given a site in this amazingly complicated hillside, a very strong topography. It's also where I used to live, and I really wanted to do something that was kind of responsive to the site. Also the context. This was formerly Red Hill in LA, which is like the bohemian/communist area in the 40s, kind of people, creatives, below the line, movie people. And anyhow, so the houses were kind of generally from 1905 to 1930, and I wanted to kind of take that context. So the idea here was to take these individual houses, but often group them together, so they looked like two houses might look like one house, or three houses might look like 1.5 houses, which was supposed to be funny, but they kind of ended up, the mass of it looks like 8 buildings instead of 18. And so this is sort of an aerial of that. There's also obviously a graphic strategy, that there's some difference created just through the simple use of 2 different kind of color graphic ways. And then the parking is a central courtyard that is, that is doubling as a parking spaces, but also kind of a central park play area. It's this lunar idea that's popular in Holland and also in Japan and not typical in LA. But so this is sort of the idea of like the 3 houses that look like 2. This is a section. So these are also kind of complicated in terms of how they follow the topography, which adds to the roof line. One of the nice things was kind of trying to create each of the houses having a really specific architectural quality, and by using these steep roof lines as a way of actually having very high, skinny spaces sometimes, and different kinds of ceiling heights really radically increase the sense of scale. So the houses are only like 800 to 1,800 square feet, but they often seem bigger. So these are some interiors that they also tend to have a front and a backyard, so they're trying to have outdoor space for everybody. And this is how radically steep that site is. So these double duplex units are actually really looking out the back to a nice view, but they're set way, way down to allow the higher units to have a view above them. And this is that central courtyard area. That's because it's not covered parking, which is like a weird loophole in LA. Generally, you have to have covered parking, which is a very wasteful mass of construction. So we were able to keep a lot of open parking. And this was my favorite thing that ever happened. There was 8 of the households got together and had a dinner party in the main courtyard, which invited me, which was amazing because that was the whole idea of create a community, you know, instead of a couple of railroad cars. This is that. Then totally different kind of location. So this is in the mountains of Santa Barbara, where it's much more about nature and siting. And this is a tinted concrete structure where the concrete's been tinted to match the kind of reddish earth. It's also referencing Santa Barbara Missions. It's a house built around 3 big courtyards, kind of like the Castle Close or the thing. But it's also it's kind of very rough hewn, so it's meant to sort of come out of the hill with big openings. These are some of the details. You can see the incredible sight of the coastline below. But so, in architecture, sometimes your local is about the natural kind of topographical or literally kind of elemental circumstances around it. It's built around courtyards because it's also very windy in the hill, so the courtyards give you a way of having outdoor space all the time, even if the other parts of the house have to be kind of closed off from the winds.
So in many ways, that segment was closest to our theme of home and away. Although, Barbara, we did notice that you had a Hudson Bay blanket on the bed.
Yes.
Of that.
They're so pretty.
There's a company in Portland that's actually making very similar ones. So
really? A knockoff?
Yeah, it's almost a
across the
knockoff.
border?
It's their version. It looks really close.
But in terms of that, so the Los Angeles examples have that kind of varying ecology of hills and things like that. And Matt, your work is very much centered, it's very urban work.
Yeah. I think, I think it's, you're trying to derive meaning out of all these projects. I mean, this, for us, it's particularly driven by a client group who really is infusing that as well. But it's hard sometimes to build this sense of space, of place, of purpose when it's an urban space. It's a Trump hotel. It was garish. We had to kind of pull it all apart. And without being too themey, like how do you create something that is referential of space and place, but not in a way that you're putting up a picture of, the CN Tower? Like how do you create that with artistic moves and inspired moves that are really going to drive a narrative, and it's for those to discover. It's not like bashing you over the face.
Well, it has the narrative of the myth of the metropolis about it. Rising up, seeing the skyline, all of those things are part of those buildings.
Yeah, I really I like the idea of community building though too. The fact that your Blackbird's development not only goes from being like this kind of sense of buildings that are just an allotment, but it really starts to create a community. I think that's a huge want and a huge need these days. I mean, it's coming up in everything that we're touching. If it's a retail store, it wants a community. If it's a hotel, it wants a community. Community wants a community, and it's great. I think it was a really successful, when you start creating these niches and these spaces, people start occupying them.
So, Barbara, you could also say that it draws upon things that have been tried in Los Angeles for a long time. For example, Schindler's house on Kings Road was essentially about an early making of a community in that way.
Well, yeah, that one where it's literally like 2 families linked together in a kind of a DNA helix, if you guys know the Kings
In a
Road
kind of
house.
odd way.
Yes, two crazy architects
do tell.
cohabiting, we living or whatever.
I don't know. I've heard a lot of stories about architects over here. I don't know. That one's shareable.
But actually, the typology I guess I looked at a lot was the Courtyard bungalow housing of LA, which is kind of, I mean, I used to live in one when I first moved to LA. But there was a typical thing in the teens through the 30s where you'd sort of have like a bunch of little, either separate bungalows or even like little rows of housing, but you'd sort of have a common path down the middle. And it was, no one here is old enough probably to remember Melrose Place, the TV show before 90210, but like that was one of those kind of courtyard places. It was just a typology where like younger people would move to the city and you live in this thing and meet everybody in the courtyard, and a lot of times you kind of strike up new friendships. I think in urbanistic, I'm sure it happens as much in like one of your buildings in the hostel or in an apartment building or some vertical metropolitan building, but LA is sort of known for having a lot more isolation, you know. The typology of the single family house sprinkled around is
Right,
less
you
conducive.
can think of your work on documenting Silver Lake.
Yeah.
And Silver Lake was a progressive community in many ways.
Yes, and had a lot of different, amazing overlaps when you sort of dig up the stories of like who, you know, Lautner's client living at the Schindler House, and they're friends with Neutra over here, who runs a salon, you know, sort of a very neighborhoody, sort of, you know, a lot of places always sound like, you know, Paris in the, you know, Weimar area, or so it's kind of all this stuff. Like, I wish I was there. I wish I'd been able to eavesdrop. But I think what's interesting is that we all want, you know, to find our tribe, our community kind of now, and how might architects help that mission as opposed to hinder it, you know, is kind of one of the questions I think is worth asking as an urbanistically oriented architect. You know, that sort of sometimes some typologies become common but are dreadful. Like in LA right now, are the scourge of our existence, which might be the equivalent of your kind of condos for nobody buildings, is called podiums. So you have like 3 stories of concrete parking with like a 3-story wood structure above, and they're just like really badly built, and there's no communal space, and they're just keep getting built over and over again. So we're all looking for
the outside ring is parking.
the first 3 floors. So the street gets killed, and then you kind of go up in your elevator, and there's not really any other communal place. It's very typical. Most of it is that's what most of the new development is right now. So I'm always looking to try and create new projects that might show a different way of you know, creating density and community at the same time. They shouldn't be exclusive.
I would argue, I mean, again, the Beats by Dre project you did. With LA, it always baffles me that it's such a well-photographed city. Everyone knows all these famous spaces, and you drive through LA and it's like there's nothing. It's like a box, and there's a box, and there's a box, and they're kind of these Doctor Who things where you go in and all of a sudden it's all there. And it's kind of like that in a lot of the city in Toronto as well. Like a lot of these spaces are foreboding, they're not inviting, they're hard walls. It's starting to change. I think it'll lead into the next discussion as well. But whereas you have to then create these community spaces within the architecture that you have. So the Beats by Dre, I think when you created that, you literally took a town and you created it back inside itself. I think it's exactly what's necessary in terms of how the need for community, the need to satisfy those needs, the social need for that. And then given the architecture you have, these spaces are not only exterior urban planning spaces, they're becoming interior spaces, they're becoming larger, smaller in scale in terms of how you deal with them. If you're dealing with small clusters of buildings, you're trying to always create all these little niches and breakout spaces that people can gather. And if you have workspaces, you're even trying to create these little breakout social spaces that are little micro communities within bigger communities. But as people are, again, I think it's part of this social exclusionary exercise of being locked into your devices or being locked into work, that when you need a reprieve from that, you need it almost instantly.
So this has been an interesting progression tonight, because we started out really talking about a whole series of projects that were, I think you'd call them market-driven programs. And it's interesting that now the discussion leads to, well, how are we changing things? How are we rethinking? How are we making community? How are we doing things? And it's really the theme on which we wanted to end this talk was to go through this thing that, especially in school, you're always thinking about, well, we are not really dealing with the world that is. We're trying to imagine a world that can be. You come out, you get involved in market-driven programs and make of it what you can. And so this is the moment for both of you to reflect on that, to think about what is that mix of clients with market-driven goals and your interest in changing things and making things better.
Good segue.
So,
Okay, let's see what we got.
Now I don't know who's up first here. Let's see.
Rethinking the world. Oh, that's
it's
you.
me. Okay. So yeah, it's a perfect segue. So we, I guess early last year we were commissioned by Hilton to help them imagine a whole new hotel brand. They have interest in opening up 200 of these, primarily in urban sites. And their guideline to us was we want to create something that's got to fit into this new urban fabric, something that can work in small spaces. It has to be, slightly below luxury, but somewhere in the lifestyle category. So that means it's something that you can be entertained in, but it's not like a full service offering where you have butlers following you around. So we worked with them holistically to help them create this brand. So our firm, we're primarily interior designers, but there's architects at the helm. I study landscape architecture. We try to take a much more systems or broader approach to design, not just looking at the kind of the detail of the finish or what have you, but looking holistically, what's the experience. So Motto, we started off, I'm not sure where this is going to point. Motto, we started off working through a series of workshops. We probably did about 15 workshops with Hilton, really leveraging off of all their history, their expertise, their data, their knowledge. And we looked at some of their operational models, like how are guests experiencing space? So we started mapping out this idea of the guest journey. What is the guest journey in its most pragmatic sense of how people are enjoying hotels? Like, this is not a hotel that has anything. We're trying to create a hotel from scratch. So, in the old days, you would hear a rumor about a hotel, and you would go to the hotel, and you'd pay at the, go to the reception desk, do that whole experience. It's shown to your room, but that's all changing now because the devices that we're using, the way that people are engaging their booking systems and learning about stuff, it's all happening at hyper speed, and it's happening without a lot of the brand's control, so through social media or what have you. So there's this whole idea of this kind of pre-arrival sequence, like what's happening before you even think about going to a hotel. And then we're kind of looking at the pre-arrival. One of the big shifts that we've seen in hospitality in the last little while, and the Ace Hotel did it really successfully in New York, and a lot of hotels are kind of engaging this idea of trying to build a community, engaging the community. I'm sure a lot of you know the big brutalist hotels around the city, which are kind of closed off and walled away from the city. Everything happens inside the core. You don't really see what's happening. We're going through a lot of efforts on projects in the city, but also with this project to kind of soften that line. So not just invite in the guest, but how do you make this a local community hub? How do you make this an activated hub and a place where people of all financial values or ideologies can kind of come together? So we looked at this kind of like this whole booking engine, how you arrive, the arrival, what does it mean, this monument of the arrival, and then what are the sequences of events that happen as you're going to your room, you're moving through the space, engaging different elements. Kind of started off as this kind of flow chart. Then we started kind of mapping it out in a little bit more of a sequential flow chart. This is kind of a decision tree. And then another thing that's really interesting as we were digging deeper into what a hotel is it's not static. It's not like you can just paint it with one brush and say, this is the sequence that's going to apply for all times. It changes during the day. There's peaks and valleys. It's in and of itself, it's a living organism. It's kind of flowing and ebbing and moving. And some of the things that you need to do is kind of change the flow to increase the activity at different times. For example, if the lobby space is typically just an arrival zone, which has a 1 to 3 minute interval and hits a couple of peak valleys based on people's travel schedules and check-in schedules, how can you activate a lobby? How can you make that lobby kind of more a communal space? Well, you have to obviously try to extend these spaces and extend the time frame in which people are going to be enjoying these spaces and try to drive more people into it. Again, this is kind of pragmatic. I'm going through just the steps, and then we'll show you some of the renderings. We're in the process of building our first project right now, so there's nothing final to show you. I'll just show you all the renderings. Then we had on top of that, we had the challenge of thinking about scalability. So not all footprints will be the same. So how do you take this kind of idea, this kit of parts, this sequence of journey, and how do you scale it up for the different environments that it could possibly go into as we're creating this brand ethos? We then break it down into, okay, what are the essential pieces that need to go into this experience? So you've got the check-in experience. Everyone has to have a check-in experience, but that's kind of disappearing a little bit now as people are pre-checking and they're swiping their keys and they're getting in without even talking to somebody. You have the notion of like the community coffee house. Every restaurant or every hotel, I feel, needs to have a bar in it. This idea of a reprieve, a snug, of an area to get away. So if everything's hustling, bustling, how do you retreat? And then one of the other elements that's, it seems pretty innocuous, but it's actually a huge community driver, is this idea of lockers, these kind of Amazon lockers, these delivery cubicles where people can come and gather things. It's almost a throwback to the historic hotels, the Grand Dames, where you used to go there and the post office would be there and the community would come in and go to the post office. Well, now people are traveling, they're ordering stuff before they get there, they need a place for it to arrive. The community itself are living in smaller and smaller footprints. You know, they don't have a concierge, so how do you deal with these how do you deal with all these kind of real world issues? And by relinquishing some space within the lobby and giving it back to the community, we feel that's a very strong notion to kind of build on that community need. I'll fly through these. We go through that. We go through a planning exercise, a hypothetical plan, and then we start thinking about some of the special elements that, I mean, Stephen, this is very influential by what you did with Tokyo Smoke, and the whole idea of a walk-up window, and right off the street, the community can engage with the retail. A very successful project that Stephen did with Tokyo Smoke down right near our office, and people are lined up. It really creates a sense of place. Desks that now kind of blend, the reception areas kind of blend into the co-working lobby spaces, so it's just an activation of the lobby. If the receptionist or the host is working there, it's just kind of like they're one more of the people who are working in this activated lobby. Coffee shops that transition from daytime to nighttime. And then one of the key things here, and this came back to a little bit of our learnings from doing the hostels, this is the kind of micro room. So a typical hotel room is about 423 square feet. So I've been working with the Americans a lot, so I still think in square feet, not square meters a lot for these rooms. But it's a very small, it's a kind of a decent sized room. These rooms go down to about 150 square feet, so they're micro hotel rooms. They're essentially trying to be Airbnb busters. It's like, how do you combat this new disruptor that's into the market, where they're giving you a room and they're giving you all the space and they're charging you less than you can charge for a hotel room? How do you do that? So you activate the public spaces, you shrink down the sleeping quarters, make a really key, essential sleeping quarter and really well thought through and make it a haven for sleep, but then get people out into the community spaces. So very tiny spaces. Everything is kind of custom designed throughout. We go through our kind of what makes that sleep experience, like how are we going to embrace that? How are we going to really own up to the claim that we're going to create great rooms to sleep in? And then we kind of go through a series of sequential of floor planning elements. Now one of the, oh, sorry, it's the next slide. So within that too, we're thinking, okay, this has to not only work in the US, but also has to work in EMEA or Europe, Asia, and so forth. So creating a bed typology, that's a whole new typology. So most beds here are based on a king, a queen, and so forth. But here we're creating a whole new mattress set that's a 2 meter by 2 meter bed that allows for multiple sleeping positions, allows for you to have a bed in a corner of a room, which is a huge no-no in the hospitality industry. You know, it's really tough to get out of bed. You don't want to disrupt your partner. So it allows for you to kind of reposition yourself within the room. And it also allows for us to do a couple of other ideas. So one of the other ideas we had is like, what if all these rooms, I'm going to go ahead a slide. What if all these rooms, they're 150 square feet, but what if you could have a 300 square foot room and you can connect 2 rooms? Or what if you could have a 450 square foot room and connect 3 rooms? And if you could do that from your phone and you can book these and you can plan, you can now have an amazing, I mean, I've got kids, I hate having kids in my room. You can now have a room where you can be sleeping, your kids can be in the next room over, they're adjoining, you can pre-book it. We've designed a certain space, this one right here, where you can have 2 co-workers, and then you can have in the middle a kind of a social breakout space. So you basically got a remote office. It's a 450 square foot office. This is what the office looks like during the day. This kind of moves up and down, becomes a boardroom table, or it can be a lounge with a big sports game. And then it can fold down and be an extra bedroom at night. So it's about taking these small spaces, thinking about how to reconfigure them, repurpose them using technology and new innovations to allow for a smaller footprint, but then allow the expandability and the flexibility within the overall hotel program. I think that's my last slide. Oh, there's the dollhouse view of that whole experience there. And that's definitely my last slide.
That's so interesting. All right, so this is a, what's the theme exactly that we're talking about?
Remaking the world.
Remaking the world, okay. So this is an adaptive reuse program. We're taking an old warehouse and making it into a children's music school. And I was just going to slide through this because the last thing is what I kind of want to show you. So this is the existing building in East Hollywood, Silver Lake Conservatory. So we kind of created a lounge off of the street. This is sort of a diagram. So there's a front lounge that acts as a waiting room / music store / a lot of the musicians who teach there hang out there. It has to do with the Red Hot Chili Peppers are kind of founded this school, and a lot of the musicians are practicing, musicians who are like session musicians. And then there's also a performance space, and there's this big bulk in the middle that's kind of interesting. It's almost a mute form, and that is because to do assembly, we had to build so many bathrooms that we wanted to do something that if we'd put them on the sides, it would have created a bottleneck. And so by just putting them in the middle and kind of wrapping them in a razzle-dazzle, it kind of acted as a way to bring light in and also define this little street that's sort of for the students. It's a kids' music school to kind of walk down, and their different teachers are in these little doorways, so they're almost like they're little houses in a village. These are just some views of that project. That's the big volume, and then there's a rather large assembly space that's used for choir and for performance and fundraisers and like larger events. The opening day. But I guess I thought kind of the project I wanted to show kind of both topics, I guess, is this winery that we did in Napa, which is very much engaged with a story that is California wine is obviously its own large industry, and it really started in the post-war era. But in general, wineries identify themselves in terms of their relationship to Europe, especially Italy and France. And so you sort of have this whole bunch of Renaissance theme parks all over Napa Valley. And our client wanted to do something that was more, kind of almost, what I like to do is sort of like a pop exaggeration of something. So sort of extremely California modern winery. And we also were able to do the landscape on this project. So it's set back from the highway, and we kind of looked back at strategies for roadside attractions and used this language of, I want to show this part, this kind of folded roof, which is maybe more like related to kind of like the high modernism of Palm Springs, like the Wexler or something like that. But it becomes like a sign for this winery that you can see from the highway, this kind of folded plate. And it sits over a relatively simple, kind of supersized case study house-ish space, but a very, kind of also affordable volume to build. And then next to it is this big production building where we just took it. It's mostly a prefab metal building, but we were able to kind of adapt the front corner to kind of speak to our other hospitality volume. So you have this sort of dialogue of two, let's say, pop versions of California high modernism talking to each other. This is the inside of that building, so obviously it's doing its job as a winery, but then this is the exterior front of the hospitality section. And the interior is super overtly modernist. Probably more so than I would have done on my own. My client was adamant that everything was, sourced from Herman Miller. But the kind of the idea of that being like using the language of domestic modernism, where sort of walls open completely and you have this sort of indoor-outdoor thing, and then it extends into the landscape, like that is actually kind of a radical concept in wineries and winery hospitality, and it's become rather popular. This is from the garden looking at it. And I guess the thing I wanted to say about the sort of these two ideas is that in California, or as a California person, LA or not, is this, we are associated indelibly with high modernism in that post-war sense, and the kind of optimism that goes with that, sort of the sunny side of the street, let's say, of architecture. And I think that's really this interesting thing. But actually, a lot of our most famous architects are also the LA school crowd, which you could say, like David Gisson describes as more like smog, like the kind of early Gehry or Moss or kind of gritty urbanism. And that, to me, there's a kind of sunshine and smog that you get to play with in California that are kind of deeply superficial subjects that you can kind of use in different ways as a sort of source material. And so I kind of enjoy like having a somewhat playful relationship to those things. I mean, it's maybe a little meta, but it actually kind of works both literally and then sometimes also the meta. I think that's all I have.
Okay, thank you. We're going to try to get questions and answers pretty quickly, but there are a lot of interesting things to explore in this last round of things. It was interesting that all of the projects we've seen are in the private realm. They're not like government-sponsored projects. They're not public projects. But yet there is this interest in saying, we're trying to make community, we're trying to transform the accessibility of travel, all of those kinds of things. So you could see it in many ways. You could say this is about the diminished power of the public sector to participate in those narratives, or you could say it's about the interest of private enterprise in taking up these themes.
I think private enterprise is seeing the kind of value that comes out of creating this hive of activity. This, again, it's well, I don't even know if it's private enterprise. I think the guest is really driving this experience. The customer, the person who's enjoying the space, they're really driving the necessity to create these spaces for them. Again, I'm going to go back to the Beats office environment. That's completely an office environment where the people are employees, but you're trying to create these social spaces because it's what those employees are demanding. It's almost what people are demanding.
Well, which is a third thing you're saying, which is it's neither of those. It's actually the consumer.
I think is driving it.
Wanting to participate in a different kind of narrative.
I don't know, Barbara. What do you think?
Well, I guess to me there's a certain, I guess I would say that for me a lot happens in daily life experiences, and that sometimes, in the, let's say, a more monumental era, people wouldn't necessarily think that non-monumental projects had any architectural value or impact, and that I would say conversely, I think actually the small project or the moment that you might experience in a given project, whether it's, a beautiful Stephen Hall chapel in Seattle or something, but you can have these very intense experiences, and honestly it's a lot more affordable to have them in a way that's smaller and but kind of a specific space. So does that...
Well, I guess I'm saying you're not having them as much in a public park anymore, or a community center or something like that.
Yeah, I think the public forum still has a huge role and still is doing a great job in many aspects of creating these spaces. But I think people want to own these spaces and have a variety of different experiences. So whereas as a park space might be in its natural state static, I think you're seeing lots of activations happening within parks to create these kind of heightened momentary experiences, exactly what you were saying, where people can, they've been to the park, but now they have this experience, a new experience within the park, and they can revisit an old friend by having this kind of playful new nod. the thing with the interiors is they're very temporal spaces. Like a lot of the spaces we're working on will kind of vanish in 7 to 12 years is the typical refresh or redesign rate. So you're kind of addressing, in a lot of the work I do, I'm addressing things and immediate needs and immediate voids. I think with time, I think these things start to expand out, and those needs and voids will start changing, and I probably in 12 years you'll see an inversion again, and the hotel will be, it's too much social, there's too many social space, I'm going to want to start closing it down, and it's going to be a bit of exclusivity, and these kind of patterns and trends weave their way in a way through interior design, quite a bit more rapid than architecture, and definitely a lot more rapid than landscape architecture, and infinitely more rapid than urbanism. So I think in the trend cycle, I think that we're able to react very quickly. It's something that's kind of moving and changing
Okay.
very fast.
Thank you. Should we queue up some questions? Audience questions.
Hi, that was a beautiful presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I'd like to say that it was really nice and interesting to see that contemporary successful practices today use methods of planning and design that I used to use when I was a student and that I find hard-pressed to use now that I'm working. So on that note, I'd like to ask, this question's aimed at you, Matt, specifically. I mean, I love how you were actually doing, you were undertaking archaeological finds in your projects. You were repurposing older elements of the buildings. I love the research and the eclecticism that went into the making of all those projects. But I wonder, in today's time, when even, say, our billionaire clients, they want more bang for their buck. Like, they want to squeeze more and more profit out of their capital. Like, how do you find you're able to convince your client to allow you to put those kind of hours into this beautiful, detailed work?
Yeah, I think it's probably the same with you. The time is definitely the ultimate luxury. No one gives time, whether it's a budget project or a luxury project. Time is just the one thing that we don't get. So for us, it's the way that we conquer that or go against that is we do a lot of brainstorming. We have a very communal office, so we try to pool as many talents as possible to compress the time and the ideation by sharing that ideation around as kind of like cluster theory. And then we encourage our staff and as much as possible our clients to be constantly educated in what they're about to endeavor on. So we try to travel as much as possible, showcase as much as possible the stuff so that it's fresh in people's minds. And then that cluster theory of creation kind of starts to unfold in a much faster time frame. So I guess many hands make light work, I guess is the saying. But yeah, the budget's a whole other separate issue. Toronto is notoriously tight with its money. Other areas are a little bit more liberal, and you can get a little bit farther ahead with the designs. It's really tough too when you're comparing it on an international format. A project that you might see in Mexico City looks amazing, but it might have cost a fraction of what it would cost to do in LA. And then when you see the project in LA, it costs astronomically more money than what it might have cost in Toronto. So and in this day and age, you're constantly referring internationally projects side by side. In these award shows, you're always side by side, but the clients don't have the same return on their investments in these different areas. And so it's kind of, you're doing the best, I think, with what you're given. And you're trying to kind of elevate it to the most luxurious aspect that you can, given the time frames that you have.
Matt, that was an interesting comment. You were supposed to represent home, but you're representing away now.
I changed sides.
Comparing things all over the world, which is actually an interesting perspective that you have on things. Like, what does it cost to do something in one place versus another? We can take one or two more quick questions.
There's another one back here.
There's a question back here.
It's probably two questions.
Matt, I love the Broadview,
Thank you.
but I want to know why you chose to model it off the strip club as opposed to the office building it was originally built as.
Yeah,
and,
I think.
And my second question for both of you is environmental stuff. Like, how do you have to convince your clients to, make things more green and try and build things more environmentally acceptable?
Do you want to handle the second part, and I'll go back for the first?
Well, I think that adaptive reuse projects are inherently fairly environmental because you're not building a new building from scratch. When we do build a new building, it's another issue, but there's a lot of governing bodies actually that we're kind of like we do well, sometimes we do LEED, but actually in California in particular, amongst the U.S. states, there's very, very strict, and then LA has its own green code. So there's a lot of things that happen now that wouldn't have happened in the past. But I think we're always looking at stuff like, can we get CLT construction certified in California, because that's, it's a recycled wood frame, eliminates steel construction, that kind of stuff. We're always looking at like how to get that going, and a lot of clients are kind of interested in that, either for their own branding, frankly, or just as kind of, as a technique that might bring costs down. But it's not, so it's ever present. I think most architects are kind of like humanists in general, and we're kind of interested in leaving the world a better place than when we got to it. So it just comes out in different ways.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the biggest challenges. It's inherent to our industry that you're creating things, that there's materials being fabricated and created, and it spawns a whole industries of manufacturing. In the realm that we're in, again, it's really tough. Things refresh every 7 years, 12 years. A restaurant might live for 5 years, and that's a full gut job. So we do try to when we approach any project, we look around to see what we can salvage, what can be retained, what can be reworked. A lot of projects we did Soho House, we bought completely, all the material was completely salvaged, from the flooring to the tile. It was all, like every element. We bought an old church that was being demolished, and used that as paneling. To convince clients to build completely green is still a challenge, and from an interiors perspective. A lot of the products and a lot of the standards being put out by the governments are, fabric has to be, soaked in a chemical that gives it a half-life of 10 billion years, and it makes it fire retardant. But so that you're combating, what the manufacturers want to do and what our local policies are inflicting on these materials as well. So yeah, it's a constant ongoing challenge. We try to be as aware as possible, but it's definitely something that, as an industry, is trying to move towards and better.
Okay, thank you, everyone. That will be our 2 questions. Thanks for coming out for this episode of Home and Away. And thank you to our guests.
Thank you.
Thank you.